Hello, welcome back to Elite Literary Book Group. I'm Rachel Beck, and thank you for purchasing Catcher in the Rye. I'm going to try to make it worth every penny for you, and probably give you more background knowledge and analysis than you need. But I think that when you're reading, at least the way that I approach it, if I know more about the other works that the author has written, and I know something about his life or her life, I tend to read it a little bit differently as I start to. I guess it makes you question the characters and the motives and all of that a little bit more, and you read more actively than passively. So I'm always going to keep suggesting to try to find out everything you can about the books. It may be easier if you watch even my lectures before you read, so that you can think about what I've said, but you will also end up analyzing things and seeing things that maybe I didn't say, and recognizing things that I didn't bring up, but because you were listening to this, you were more aware. And it's an interesting process. It just asking a question and putting it out there. Sometimes serendipitously things are very clear to you, like what happened with me when I read Franny and Zooey for the first time, and had no idea the way of the pilgrim was going to be brought up. And it changed kind of the way I saw then as I was teaching Catcher in the Rye. And I thought, wow, I feel like this much closer to Salinger. Now, with that said, I should say that very hard to get close to Salinger, because he became reclusive after Catcher in the Rye. And before that, he had some success with stories and was printed. It took a while, just like everybody else. It took a lot of work, but finally he got published in the New Yorker, which is still is a very big deal, and also published in Story, and a few others I can't think of right now. But he he started off with short stories, which is the same way Fitzgerald had to start, the same way Hemingway had to start. And so I'm thinking that if you are aspiring to be a writer someday, you might want to consider, just as I've had to tell myself this, to maybe look at some smaller projects before you get to the bigger ones. And that will teach you a lot about writing, and it'll also teach you a lot about the market. But I want to say something about the way Salinger felt about this publishing market, and especially in terms of feeling like these people are phony. He had a very hard time even trying to convince, of course, just like anybody else who writes a classic, it seems like the people in that day and age don't get it. And no big surprise that some prominent literary people looked at Catcher in the Rye and said, oh, so is Holden Caulfield crazy, or what's going on? Which probably just really irritated Salinger, because just to think that they didn't have enough depth to understand this person really says a lot more about the people reading it, who are just taking it literally and can't understand that, okay, it's not just this little whiny kid out of prep school. There's something else going on here. And I think he kind of sums up the whole publishing and how he felt about his work by the way that he talks about the older brother, who now is successful. He refers to him as DB. And in the beginning, DB was just a writer. And he said that well, he's got a lot of dough now. He didn't used to. He used to just be a regular writer when he was home. He wrote this terrific book of short stories, The Secret Goldfish, in case you never heard of him. The best one in it was The Secret Goldfish. It was about this kid that wouldn't let anybody look at his goldfish because he'd bought it with his own money. It killed me. Now he's in Hollywood, DB, being a prostitute. So I think that that's kind of, in publishing, and if you're a writer, you have to really think about this, as it's very hard to reconcile someone with an artistic temperament to the fact that you're selling your work to make money, and that's what publishers want. That's what they care about. They're the aesthetics and all this, brilliant things that you may have come up with. If it doesn't sell, they don't care. And so this is the fight that Salinger had to fight with, not being willing to rewrite Catcher in the Rye so that it can be somewhat normal. And because it was, because it broke all the rules and because it was so controversial, people wanted to read it more. And it actually drew more attention than he ever imagined, which, is kind of a, he's kind of contradicting himself in a way, because he wanted to be a famous writer. He wanted to be well known. But then when he was well known and was really famous, and everybody wanted to now talk to him and interview him, and it's expected that if you write a book that you spend some time doing a publicity tour of some kind, and the publishing company expects you to do that. And Salinger wasn't willing to do that, and they had to actually say, look, do you just want this book to be printed, or do you want to sell books? Because we sell books. And Salinger fought them on everything, from the cover to, he didn't want his face on the back of it. He didn't want people to know who he was. But this is also a time that he's just came back from war, and it's kind of like what I said in the last introduction to The Great Gatsby. The lost generation, the people that came back from the war, what are you coming back home to? Everything now in light of battle seems very frivolous, and people, especially with the things that they worry about and their little concerns and their problems, it all seems very small in comparison. And this is also, it's, as far as professionally, your job, your profession, or whatever, this is where he, I think, had the biggest problem with phonies. And I'll give you an example of that. Let's say that someone is working on his doctorate degree in psychology, okay? And yes, he's done a lot of reading and research and dissertation and a lot of work, a lot of study. And so he's going to be qualified to talk to someone like Salinger, who is suffering from post-traumatic stress. But the big difference is the psychiatrist has never actually been in battle, and Salinger has. So how is this academic person going to come in and fix Salinger or whoever he's writing about these? And I am going to point out to you a couple of stories that was even before Catcher that I think is worth reading, just to try to get a closer glimpse of what Salinger is thinking, because Salinger is so private. He doesn't talk about the work. In fact, with Catcher in the Rye, he actually got to the point where he just said, you know what, it's a fictional story. I didn't mean any of it, And people who knew Salinger knew that wasn't true, because they heard his voice through Holden Caulfield. So they recognized him. And Salinger also kind of gave himself away when he did an interview for a young girl at a high school. He wasn't talking to anybody, but he was still communicating with these these kids at this high school, and the story got out, and then it was supposed to just be a school story, but it was a lead because nobody was able to get Salinger to talk, and so it was printed in these big publications, and he never talked to the kids again. He was very resentful, and I've read a little bit of his biography, and it seems like there was a side of him that could really hold a grudge. With one of his close friends, I think he was the editor of Story. Uh, when he couldn't get what he wanted after that, he just like wanted to end the relationship completely. Um, it, it seems like once he was felt burned or hurt or betrayed in any way, then he was done. Um, and the movie that they did kind of shows that. I mean, they're working with just about as much information as anyone else, so they're projecting a lot in that film. But in one of the scenes, his either girlfriend or wife asked, I think it's his wife at the time, how can you be practicing all this spiritual Zen Buddha stuff and then you can't even forgive? So I do think there was some issues with Salinger in that way. But going back to the phony business, the clues that you have into getting closer to Salinger, I think, is to look at his 9 stories if you're really interested in where he's coming from, because the themes are reoccurring. For instance, in the banana fish, Perfect Day for Banana Fish, Seymour, who shows up, actually, he's part of the Glass family, the book I alluded to in the last lecture with Franny and Zooey. That's the older brother. Now, this gives a short story about how he's come back, and the only thing how you know what's going on with him is by a conversation that his wife is having with her mother. Okay, and the mother is the typical insensitive, I think he's gone mad, he's crazy. What does the doctor say? Well, of course, the doctor is, and this is also a time people were not really familiar, or they had a lot of experience with post-traumatic stress. In fact, it kind of had a stigma for a long time, and psychiatrists thought that it was some kind of weakness in a man. Some people even accused them of latent homosexuality or something like that. So there was always like this insensitivity to it and not understanding it fully, as if there was something wrong with the man to begin with. And so they're having this conversation, and in the story he takes this little girl out to look for banana fish. And what's interesting when you see how he acts with children, he always treats them like they're adults. He doesn't talk down to them. My son will tell me, like, one of the things that really irritates him about some of his teachers is they just talk to us like we're babies. I mean, they're just like the way I can explain that when teachers do that is that they are playing a role, and they're playing teacher role, and you're supposed to be playing student role, and that's why it's not natural, because they are identifying with this type rather than just being, naturally themselves. And it comes off as fake, right? It always does. And so in these stories, whenever he's talking to a child, or the soldier's talking to a child, he always talks to them like and in fact, probably like, you're the expert. And Wordsworth said, the child is the father of man. This idea, this emphasis on children is really more of a romantic quality, because romanticism is interested in the imagination. And the child has not yet conformed to society. They haven't become a certain role. Shakespeare understood this, I think, better than anyone, because life is like a stage, and everyone is playing a part. And his tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow soliloquy creeps in this petty pace until the last syllable of time. Out, out, brief candle. Life is but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his day on the stage and is heard of no more. So we're playing this role. We want to get on stage. We want to do our act. At some point, we die and then we're not heard of anymore. And it's meaningless. It's absolutely meaningless. But the idea, the identification is very much ego. The ego wants to identify. Just like if you feel like you're a certain type of person, maybe a cowboy, pro-gun, all that kind of stuff, you might want to drive a big truck. You might want to have flags hanging in the back, even if it's in truth disrespectful to the flag. It shows who you are. You're identified with that. But that's not really who you are. That's just what you've identified with. And so that's what he's talking about in terms of people becoming like phonies, and people who, for instance, in my field, people who have master's and doctorate degrees in education and have argued with me over books like Catcher in the Rye and Huckleberry Finn that there's no real point in anyone reading these books, and that they've done the research and they have a higher degree than me. And so, I've heard people with doctorate degrees in education say, I never had to read a book and I'm fine. and then they try to belittle you by saying, well, you don't have the degree in education. It's like, well, that's because I was teaching. But at any rate, that kind of arrogance is the same kind of arrogance that someone like Salinger, who's seen the worst that you could possibly see. I also want to bring this up about World War II. When I was teaching King Lear, and I was doing research and stuff like that, I came across a point where people were asking the question, is King Lear too sad? Is it too tragic? And then after World War II, after the Holocaust, people stopped asking that question, because the sad truth is that reality is worse. That the most horrific things we couldn't even imagine that really happened. So that took care of that question. But anyways, I'm kind of all over the place, sorry. Back to the short stories. So at the end, after he has this connection with this little girl, and he gets back, and he has kind of this paranoia where he feels like somebody's looking at his feet, and he accuses someone, you're looking at my feet. She's like, it's not looking at your feet. And he gets real upset about it, and then he goes back into the room and he kills himself while his girlfriend is sleeping in the bed next to him. So it's obviously a very dark story. The other story is about another soldier who has post-traumatic stress. And again, there's this insensitivity about, his roommate's girlfriend is studying psychology, and the class would love to talk about him and learn from him and have this discussion. And he, as he's walking in this little town in England, stops to listen to a choir sing in a church, and it's a choir of kids. So again, you have the children, and the story is for Esme with Love and Squalor. And Esme is a little girl who's very articulate, and she's been through a traumatic event. Both her parents have died, and she's very mature, and they are having a conversation. And this for some reason, just this small communication, honest, sincere communication with a child is helping him be able to cope with all the other realities around him. That innocence is played in here. And then in Catcher in the Rye, you see that really it's the innocence of Phoebe. So um, that kind of tells you where Salinger is as far as where he wants to go thematically with this book. Just like these soldiers are not crazy, Holden isn't either. It's really everyone else, I guess, that is conforming and identifying with certain roles and playing a part that starts to really drive him crazy. So um, I think one of the most touching things here, though, that has always stayed with me, it seems a little bit disjointed, but he goes back and he has the same job as Salinger. You know, he's just arrested a Nazi woman and he's looking through her stuff. And he comes across a book that she has written in. And this line has always haunted me. It just says, sorry, "Dear God, life is hell." And that's all it says. Now, we know that life is hell for the Jewish people during this time. It's kind of curious why this is coming from this Nazi woman. Of course, she did just get arrested, but he's thinking, what is hell? And he thinks about what something Dostoevsky said about hell being, for one thing, separation. Hell is separation, but it's also separation from God. But it's also the inability to love. And when you're going through something like the soldier's going through, post-traumatic stress, what he's having a very difficult time doing is connecting and loving people. Now, he can do that with the child, but he can't do that with the other people in terms of Catcher in the Rye, the people who have fallen off this cliff into this phony adult world. So my introductions, as usual, are going a little bit too long, but I will bring up things as they come up in reading Catcher in the Rye. Some things will come to me, maybe go back to something in a short story or something like that as well. If you want more information about Salinger, there's a little documentary called Salinger Doesn't Want to Talk. And so they did a documentary on how he doesn't want to talk, and they did get some people to testify to his character. One of the things that we'll look at first is the prep school that he's at, which is supposed to be Valley Forge, which he went to prep school. So I do think that he has a lot in common with Holden. His father had great expectations, very ambitious person. His mother was more understanding. In fact, he dedicated the book to his mother, but they were still also private people. Like Holden suggests his parents, like, if I went into all this stuff with you, my parents would have 2 hemorrhages apiece if I said anything. They're very touchy people. And so Salinger is also very private. But what happened when he became more reclusive, people became even more curious about him and would go like on pilgrimages to see him and show up at his door. And he, of course, anybody would hate that. And I'm sure these people meant well, but you know, they interview some of these guys who just seem like buffoons that they would do this. And you know, one of them was like, I asked him, you know, why aren't you writing? And he says, I need my privacy. And he says, well, I can understand that. And Salinger says, no, you couldn't understand that, because if you did, you wouldn't be here. And but I think that only kind of confirmed that Salinger was like Holden, because it really seems like something Holden would do. So there's that. There's also, I've mentioned before that his father was Jewish, and one of the things that comes up early, at least they try to do this in the movie, is that the father did not really want to be associated with his heritage. Now, look at what's happened. there's probably a good reason for that. But I don't think he was particularly religious in practicing, because um, they supposedly practiced or celebrated Passover and Christmas. And, I think that religion probably was, for Salinger, kind of a beginning of an identity crisis, because, like, well, who am I? Am I Jewish? Am I Catholic? And I also want to point out that people were not big on Catholics either. That Martin Luther King actually didn't want to vote at first for John F. Kennedy because he was Catholic. So that just kind of shows you how prejudiced people were. I mean, you were supposed to be good Protestants, and that's what schools wanted from you. And so Salinger wasn't a very good student. He was kind of lazy at first, and I think that his father probably thought he needed more discipline, and he ended up at Valley Forge. But what's interesting, like I've said before, is he really wanted to be involved in the war. He really wanted to make a sacrifice. And he ended up surviving it, living through it, and through all of that, he kept his idea of Holden Caulfield with him, and then was able to write only when he got back and settled down and disciplined himself also to be sort of like a monk in a way, like a hermit. If you listen to like what the people who actually lived with him and spent some time with him have said, they've said just looking at what he ate, everything was very plain. His way of life was quite simple, and I think that he was trying to get rid of ego, and that I think if you can do that is where you can probably reach the deepest and get into the best art that you can possibly produce. But ego will hold you back, and I think he definitely saw that.